Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to tackle something pretty massive: the rise and fall of civilizations.
Definitely a big one.
We've got some great source material from you all out there, too, so thanks for sending that in. This stuff is, well, it's pretty fascinating. We're going to be looking at how these huge societies popped up, did their thing, and then eventually, well,
Yeah, they don't tend to last forever.
right. But the cool thing is, even though every civilization is unique, there are these kind of common patterns that keep popping up. It's
Yeah.
like almost like a blueprint of how we humans, how we do
And
things.
how we mess things up too.
Huh. Yeah, there's definitely that. But okay, before we jump into specific civilizations, let's start with the basics. When we talk about a civilization being great, what does that even mean?
Mm.
Is it all about like conquering land and having a big army? Or is there more to it than that?
Well, that's something historians have been arguing about forever, really. And it's definitely not a simple answer. Sure, conquering and military stuff is part of it, but that's kind of like the tip of the iceberg. You gotta look deeper.
So what's down there at the bottom of that iceberg?
Well, we gotta think about the basics, resources, geography. Those are huge starting points. You need access to stuff like water, good farmland, the things people need to survive and build stuff.
Makes sense. It's all about location, right?
Absolutely. Location, 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 just like real estate. Um, Take Mesopotamia, for example. It's called the cradle of civilization for a reason.
Right. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates.
Exactly. And those rivers, they flooded every year. Sounds kind of bad, but actually that flooding brought in super fertile soil. And that meant they could grow tons of food, which led to, well, more people, bigger cities, and eventually all the complex stuff that makes a civilization.
And hey, speaking of rivers, our source material also talks about ancient Egypt and how basically their whole civilization was built around the Nile River.
Oh, yeah, totally. The Nile was like their lifeline. Egypt's pretty dry. But those yearly floods from the Nile brought in water and this amazing silt that made the land super fertile.
So basically free fertilizer every year.
Pretty much. That's how they grew so much food, built those crazy pyramids and temples. I mean, transporting those giant stones, all thanks to the Nile.
I can't even imagine trying to move those things without like cranes and trucks and stuff.
Yeah, they were pretty ingenious. But okay, even with good geography and resources, it's not automatic, right? Plenty of societies had those things, but didn't become like the Roman Empire.
So what's the missing ingredient? What did the Romans figure out that others didn't?
Well, strong leadership, definitely. A system of government that, actually works, and a sense of shared culture, something that brings people together and makes them feel like they're all part of something bigger.
So it's more than just like brute force. It's about creating a system that works.
Exactly. The Romans, they didn't just conquer, they built stuff. Roads, aqueducts, those amazing structures that brought fresh water to their cities. They created laws, they had a standard currency, they made things efficient.
They were thinking long term. It wasn't just about survival. It was about creating a good life for their people.
Exactly. They were building a civilization that could last.
All right, so we've got the basics down: resources, geography, strong leadership, and a shared culture. Those seem like the key ingredients for a great civilization. Oh, and actually, the source material suggests some videos that show all this stuff visually. We'll include those in the show notes so you can check them out.
Great idea. Always good to see the stuff in action, Makes it more real.
Definitely. But okay, so civilizations get started, they get those basics down. But when did they really start to shine? When did they hit those like legendary peaks we hear about, like golden ages?
Ah, the golden ages. That's when things get really exciting. Think of it like this. You've got all those building blocks we just talked about, and during a golden age, they all come together perfectly. It's like this burst of energy where everything's clicking. You get incredible art, groundbreaking discoveries, and just this feeling that society is making huge leaps forward.
Like hitting their stride, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's in sync and things are just working.
Exactly. A perfect example is the Islamic Golden Age, from like the 8th to the 13th centuries. This was a time when scholars from all over the Islamic world were making huge contributions to math, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, you name it.
Oh, yeah. I remember learning about this in school. Didn't they have that like super famous mathematician, the one who basically invented algebra?
You got it. Al-Khwarizmi.
He came up with the concept of algorithms, those step-by-step instructions that computers use today. And his work on algebra, totally revolutionary. I mean, we still use his ideas today.
Wow. To think that stuff from so long ago is still shaping our world.
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing. Oh, yeah. And it's just one example. There were tons of scholars during the Islamic Golden Age who had a huge impact, not just on their own time, but on, well, on the whole world, really. Their ideas spread and they influenced how we think and do things even now.
Okay, so that's one golden age. Are there any other examples we should know about?
Tons, like the European Renaissance, for instance, that was from the 14th to 17th centuries. Think Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Galileo. They were rediscovering the art and knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome, but they were also pushing things forward in science, art, exploration, you name it.
It was like this explosion of creativity, right? After
Yeah.
a long time where things were kind of, well, not so exciting.
Yeah, it was like they were waking up to all the possibilities again.
So what made these golden ages happen? Was it just luck? Or were there specific things that made them possible?
Well, historians are still debating that one. But one thing seems pretty clear, stable leadership helps a lot. When you don't have constant wars or like political chaos going on, people have more time and energy to focus on art and science.
It's like you need a solid foundation to build something
Yeah.
amazing.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole idea of patronage. Think of it like this. You've got these super talented artists, scientists, thinkers, but they need support. They need someone to like fund their work, give them the space and resources to create.
Right. Like those wealthy families in Renaissance Italy, the Medicis. They were huge patrons of the arts.
Exactly. They recognized that supporting artists and scientists was good for everyone. It brought prestige, it pushed society forward, and it created this amazing legacy that we still benefit from today.
So they were kind of like investors in creativity, right?
Yeah, exactly. Investing in the future. And another thing that really fueled those golden ages was the exchange of ideas. Think about the Islamic Golden Age scholars from all over the place. Persia, India, Arabia were coming together, sharing their knowledge, translating texts from ancient Greece and Rome. It was like a giant melting pot of ideas.
That's so cool. It's like they were crowdsourcing knowledge way back then.
Yeah. They knew that the best way to learn and grow was to be open to new ideas no matter where they came from. And that openness led to some incredible breakthroughs.
This is fascinating stuff. But I have a question. If golden ages are like the peak of a civilization, do they also contain the seeds of, well, of potential problems? Like, is there a downside to all this success?
That's a really interesting question. And, well, the answer is yeah, sometimes. Even when things seem amazing, there can be hidden vulnerabilities that, well, that can come back to bite you later.
Wait, seriously? It's like there's a dark side to success. But what could possibly go wrong when everything seems to be going so right? It's kind of mind-blowing, right?
Huh.
That being super successful could actually set you up for, well, for failure later on.
It is. It's like a built-in trap in a way. Civilizations, they're always pushing forward, trying to be better, stronger, you know. But sometimes in that push, they create weaknesses and they don't even realize it.
So what kind of weaknesses? Give me an example.
Well, take this becoming too dependent on one thing. Like, let's say a civilization gets really good at using a specific resource, or they build their whole system around one technology.
Okay, I'm seeing where you're going with this.
Yeah.
What happens if that resource runs out or that technology, like, stops working?
Exactly. It's like putting all your eggs in one basket. If that basket breaks, well, you're in trouble. A civilization that's too specialized, too reliant on just one thing is incredibly vulnerable.
And history is full of examples of that, right?
Yeah.
Civilizations that were booming because they had, like, the best iron ore or controlled the trade routes for silk.
Yeah.
But then something changes. The resource dries up. Someone else figures out a new way to do things.
Right. And if you can't adapt, you're in big trouble. Adaptability, being able to change and adjust, that's key to surviving for the long haul.
Makes sense. And this brings us to, well, to the not so fun part of our conversation, the reasons why civilizations fall. I mean, it's not just one thing, right? It's usually a bunch of factors all coming together.
Right, it's complicated. But the source material breaks it down into three major areas that keep popping up throughout history. Environmental problems, overexpansion, and then this combo of economic inequality and social unrest.
Okay, let's break those down, starting with environmental stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like almost every civilization has messed up their environment in some way.
Yeah, it's kind of a sad pattern, isn't it? Like the Mayans, for example. They were incredible mathematicians, astronomers. They built these impressive cities. They had this sophisticated system of agriculture.
Right, they had that whole calendar thing figured out too.
Exactly. But they also relied heavily on this slash and burn agriculture. And then on top of that, they had these periods of severe drought.
So basically they were clearing land and then not having enough rain to, like, replenish it.
Right. And over time, that led to deforestation. The soil got depleted. They couldn't grow as much food. It was a classic case of, well, not being sustainable. Their practices worked for a while, but they didn't adapt, and eventually it caught up with them.
It's like a cautionary tale, right? Don't mess with Mother Nature. Okay, what about overexpansion? The source material talks about how the Roman Empire got so big, it basically became impossible to manage.
Ah, the Romans. A classic example of how bigger isn't always better. They were amazing at conquering and building, but eventually their empire just stretched too far.
I mean, imagine trying to rule an area that stretches from, like, England all the way to the Middle East. That's got to be a logistical nightmare.
Totally. It puts a huge strain on your resources. It's hard to communicate. And keeping everyone happy, forget about it. You end up with distant provinces that feel neglected, local governors getting corrupt, and then boom, internal conflicts start popping up.
So it's like that saying, the center cannot hold.
Exactly. Overexpansion weakens you from the inside. And when you're weak, well, that's when outside forces start to see an opportunity.
Yeah, the barbarians at the gates. It's like the Roman Empire had this perfect storm, brewing internal problems, logistical issues, and then all these outside forces ready to pounce.
Right. A recipe for disaster, for sure. They teach you about this in every history class. There's got to be a balance between ambition and, well, being realistic about what you can handle. Between growing and making sure what you already have is, solid and stable.
Okay, so we've got environmental problems, we've got overexpansion, but what about this thing with economic inequality and social unrest? The source material says that's a huge EE factor in how civilizations collapse.
Yeah, and it's a really important one, especially today. Think about it. When the gap between the rich and the poor gets too big, when people feel like the system is rigged against them, that's when things get really unstable.
Like a pressure cooker waiting to explode, right?
Exactly. And history is full of those explosions. Take the French Revolution, for example. You had the super rich aristocracy living it up in their palaces, and then you had the vast majority of people struggling just to survive.
Yeah, and they were paying all the taxes too, while the rich got away with, well, with basically everything. No wonder they got mad.
Right. And that resentment, that feeling of being treated unfairly, it built up and built up until, boom, the whole system came crashing down. The storming of the Bastille, the Reign of Terror. It was a wake-up call to anyone in power. You can't ignore the needs and the anger of the people forever.
So it's like a reminder that social justice matters, that everyone needs to have a fair chance, that the wealth needs to be shared more equally.
Exactly. If people feel like they're being left behind, if they feel like the system doesn't care about them, well, that's a recipe for revolution.
Okay, so we've looked at these historical patterns, environmental problems, overexpansion, economic inequality, all pretty serious stuff. But let's be real, are these ancient examples really relevant to us today? I mean, we're not living in the Roman Empire. We've got technology. We're globally connected. It's a whole different world,
Yeah,
right?
it seems that way, doesn't it? Like we've evolved past all that old stuff. But if you look closely, you start to see some pretty striking parallels. I mean, the challenges we face today, they might look different on the surface, but underneath, a lot of those same fundamental issues are still at play.
So you're saying it's like the game has changed, but the basic rules are still the same.
Yeah. Human nature, well, it hasn't changed all that much. We're still capable of amazing things, but we also tend to make the same mistakes over and over again. That's why studying history is so important. It helps us understand those patterns of things we keep messing up, and maybe, just maybe, it can help us avoid repeating those mistakes in the future.
Okay, I'm getting chills here. But let's get down to brass tacks. How do those ancient patterns actually show up in our modern world? What are the modern-day versions of those challenges?
Well, let's take environmental problems, for example. The Mayans had their deforestation and droughts, which were bad enough, but we're dealing with something even bigger now, climate change. I mean, this is a global issue, right? Rising sea levels, crazy weather events, species going extinct. It's like the Mayan situation, but on a massive scale.
And it's not just climate change, right? Our source material talks about how we're depleting resources like crazy, polluting the oceans, destroying habitats. It's like we've taken those ancient mistakes and supersized them.
Yeah, it's pretty scary when you think about it. And we're not just talking about the environment either. Remember that whole thing about political instability? Well, look around. Populism is on the rise. Countries are becoming more divided, people don't trust their governments, and misinformation is spreading like wildfire.
Yeah. It's like everyone's shouting at each other and no one's listening.
Exactly. And it's creating this sense of chaos, of things falling apart, just like what happened to those ancient empires. The specifics might be different, but that underlying dynamic, the loss of trust, the feeling that the system is broken, it's all too familiar.
And then there's economic inequality, which, well, that seems to be getting worse everywhere you look.
Absolutely. Globalization has brought a lot of good things, don't get me wrong, but it's
Yeah.
also led to this massive concentration of wealth in the hands of a very few people. Wages haven't kept up, and a lot of folks are feeling left behind.
The source material is pretty clear about this. It's basically a repeat of what happened in those ancient civilizations. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and eventually something's got to give.
Right. And when that happens, well, it's usually not pretty. Revolutions, social unrest, violence, it's all part of that historical pattern.
Okay, this is a lot to take in, but here's the big question. If we're facing these same fundamental problems that brought down civilizations in the past, are we, like, doomed? Is collapse inevitable?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's where things get really interesting. Because here's the thing. Unlike those ancient civilizations, we have some pretty powerful tools at our disposal.
Wow.
I mean, think about it. We have global communication, advanced science, incredible technology. We have things they couldn't even dream of.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There's hope.
Uh-huh.
But how do we actually use those advantages to fix things?
Yeah.
How do we, like, turn knowledge and technology into solutions?
Uh-huh.
It does feel like we're at this, like, turning point, right? We've got all this knowledge from the past, all these examples of what worked and what went wrong.
Yeah.
And now it's up to us to decide, well, what do we do with it?
Yeah, it's a pretty intense moment when you think about it. Like, we have this chance to either repeat those same old mistakes or to, like, actually learn from them and create something better.
The source material really drives that point home. It's not about fate. It's about choices.
Yeah.
We're not just, like, stuck in some predetermined loop, you know. We can actually make a difference. But where do we even start? It all seems so big.
Totally. It's easy to get overwhelmed, for sure. But one thing that really helps, I think, is to remember that all these problems are connected. You can't just focus on climate change without thinking about social justice, without thinking about global cooperation.
It's like that saying, everything's connected, right?
Yeah, exactly. We need that systems thinking to understand how all the pieces fit together. And then, well, then we can start finding solutions that actually address the root causes, not just the symptoms.
Right. It's not enough to just put a Band-Aid on things. You got to fix the whole system.
Yeah.
But okay, that's all well and good. But how do we actually dome that? How do we go from, like, talking about problems to actually solving them? The source material talks a lot about technology and how that's a key part of the solution.
Yeah, technology is interesting. It's a double-edged sword, really. I mean, it's caused some of the problems we're facing, but it also has the potential to help us get out of this mess.
So it's how we use it that matters.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Think about renewable energy, for instance, or sustainable agriculture, or advancements in healthcare and education. These are all areas where technology can make a huge difference.
Right. But technology by itself isn't enough, right? It's about our values, our ethics, the choices we make about how we use these tools.
Absolutely. Technology is just a tool like a hammer or a saw. You can use it to build something amazing, or you can use it to, well, to cause harm. It all depends on the person holding the hammer.
And that's where that idea of moral imagination comes in, right?
Yeah.
The source material talks about that being able to imagine a better future and then actually making choices that get us there.
Yeah, that's such an important concept. We got to be able to see beyond the way things are now to imagine something better. A world where technology helps everyone, not just a few lucky people. A world where clean energy and education and healthcare are like basic human rights.
Right. It's about changing our priorities. Instead of just thinking about profits, we got to think about sustainability, about making sure everyone has a chance to thrive.
Totally. It's about like expanding our circle of concern, thinking about the well-being of the whole planet, not just our own little corner of it. But that's a big shift, right? A big change in how we think and how we act.
Definitely. It's challenging the status quo. It's being willing to do things differently. But you know what? In the end, it all comes down to us, right?
Yeah.
To people.
Totally. We can have all the technology and all the fancy ideas in the world, but if we don't change ourselves, if we don't change our hearts and minds, then, well, nothing's really going to change.
The source material ends with this really powerful question. What legacy will we leave behind? What kind of world do we want to create?
It's a big question, and it's one we each have to answer for ourselves. It's not just about, like, big sweeping actions. It's about the small choices we make every day, the things we buy, the way we treat each other, the causes we support.
Right. It's all connected, like we were saying before. Every little thing adds up.
Exactly. It's like those little drops of water that over time can carve out canyons. Our actions, they have that same power to shape the world around us for better or for worse.
So, to our listener, we'll leave you with that thought.
Hmm.
What's your contribution going to be? What kind of world do you want to see?
Remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about trying. It's about learning from the past, using the tools we have, and working together to create a future that's, well, a future that's worth leaving behind for the next generation.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the rise and fall of civilizations. We hope you learned something, got inspired, and maybe, just maybe, started thinking about how you can be part of building a better future. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep making history.